South Sudan may have gained independence, but the region is still battling to get its tarnished human rights record up to scratch. The United Nations Human Rights Commission report paints a bleak picture of the East Central Africa country. It says a lack of arrests will drive up more violence. The Commission says South Africa has a major role to play as the new AU chair. To discuss the report and situation in that country, we're joined by Barney Afako from the Commission on Human Rights in South Sudan. Thanks for your time, sir. We appreciate it. I was looking at one of the headlines, and it says that the warring sides are deliberately starving citizens. Tell us how so.
Because what we're saying is that when a state denies its citizens the means of livelihoods, sometimes by displacing them, sometimes by the forces that are in conflict, attacking their granaries, their sources of food, that amounts to starvation. And we're pointing this out because the numbers are very large of those who are affected by this within the country. Although a significant section of the population is actually outside the country, over 2 million South Sudanese are refugees. There are those who are in the country but displaced or living in fear of armed groups attacking them and their homes and livelihoods.
Yeah. So why is there still no solution to what's happening in South Sudan and many other African countries? We have the AU trying to intervene. We have the United Nations, for instance, also trying to intervene in several countries. But we're not seeing any closure to the conflict in these areas.
Because these conflicts are quite complex and they have very deep roots. South Sudan came into existence because there was a long struggle for independence and self-determination. Sudan, from which South Sudan broke away, became independent in 1956, 1st of January. But since 1955, there has been conflict in the southern part of Sudan almost constantly, except for 4 short years in the 70s. So that's a country that gained independence without any infrastructure, with the population divided, with no sense of citizenship. They're only now beginning to craft a national identity. So the divisions are very deep. But we believe that they can work through these issues politically. We want them to eliminate weapons from the political discourse. And that will take time. It takes pressure to be applied on them, but also encouragement to fulfill the agreements that they have signed. They signed an agreement in 2015 to end the war. It's a very full and impressive document if it's implemented, and we're urging them to do that. It covers all issues of governance, economy, security arrangements as part of the package. And we believe the elements are there to resolve these conflicts. And it takes the weight of countries like South Africa, organizations like the UN and the AU painstakingly to apply pressure on the leaders to stop the war and to govern responsibly.
Yeah, I want to split what you said up because I'll talk about South Africa's role as chair of the AU in a moment, but the power and the greed for power in South Sudan and many other African countries is ultimately responsible for the conflict we're seeing. People will, of course, come out and speak against it. They'll try to get whoever they want in charge to be in charge, but that's not the reality. So if you have 2 warring sides constantly going and being greedy for power, how do you actually resolve it? Because neither are willing to budge.
I think one of the things you do is you remove the incentives for conflict, because the characteristic of these conflicts is that they are fought at the cost of civilian lives and livelihoods. And so you make sure that there's accountability when those lines are crossed. In the South Sudan case, there is an agreement and indeed a decision of the African Union that there should be a hybrid court. What that court will do is to punish those who targeted civilians during the conflict. So it's a disincentive for repeating that type of conduct. That's why it's an important pillar of what we're trying to do. But in addition to a hybrid court, there's also a Commission for Truth, Reconciliation and Healing. This is based on the understanding that a society needs to deal with its differences together and agree on a framework for coexistence. And if they don't do that, then there will be those, as you say, who will exploit the situation for gain. If they don't build a sense of a nation, a sense of citizenship, then people begin to identify with their ethnic groups and use other identities. But it is only by transforming those identities into that of a citizen that everybody can invest in stability in the country, because you will not be discriminated against because of your origins, for instance. So that form of nation building is a very important element of stabilizing nations and preventing the violations that are associated with conflict.
And very quickly, South Africa's role as a chair of the AU currently, how do we hold these people accountable when, again, I will say that we know they're not likely to listen?
I think that is beginning to change. The world is not the same place it was 10 or more years ago. You now have an international criminal justice framework, including the International Criminal Court. You will see that the new authorities in Khartoum are now speaking of handing over President Bashir to the ICC, for example. And that should send out a signal to leaders who violate the rights of their citizens, that justice might be slow, but at the end of the line, they're going to have to answer for those deeds. And what the African Union has done in relation to South Sudan is to introduce this idea of a hybrid court, which is an African mechanism. We should have South Sudanese judges and other judges from other parts of Africa to deal with these types of crimes. So we're beginning to put the infrastructure in place to hold people accountable, and countries like South Africa can encourage the establishment of transitional justice mechanisms, including the hybrid court, can encourage the leaders of South Sudan to implement the agreement that they've signed, to form the government within the next 2 days, and to then begin to have a unity government.
All right. Thank you so much for your time and your insight. Appreciate it.